Games can sometimes be really difficult to clear. Well, unless you are a certified epic gamer like I am, in which case everything out there, not an issue. But, unless you are me, you probably have used a wiki or game walkthrough sometime in your life to get your way through the last bits of the game which seem to confound you for ages. And if you are a boomer like me, you may remember a strange period of the early internet where some people had a very good impression of Japanese wikis specifically, especially when it came to certain RPG games. And this became even more so when certain more RNG mobile games, I wouldn't know of any, came onto the scene. In fact, it was during that era where these wikis exploded in such popularity that some companies actually managed to step in and corporatize most of the Japanese game walkthrough and wiki scene up until a certain point. And so I want to look at all of this, the history of how Japanese wikis became popular initially, what they have ended up becoming now, and why you might not want to put all of your faith into the more corporate ones that exist today. So, game guides in Japan can be traced back to the earliest days of the internet's inception in Japan, back in 1996 when the infrastructure was first set up and opened to the public by Yahoo. The same year as this, baby! Look, I know this thing probably got a lot of memes about it causing hand injury, but you can trust me when I say that it doesn't really cause And the history of wikis themselves can be split into 3 separate distinct eras, where they were first run by individual randos on the internet. That's a word that's banned on Twitch. Shh, no one tell anyone. Then groups of people gathering in the communities, and finally by corporations, although in the current day and age, we're slowly starting to see a pushback away from corporations running most of these walkthroughs as well. Yes, the early 90s, where .coms were bubbling, Bernies were made of thing, and Superman 64 was getting ready to rear its ugly head upon this world. Yes, there will be many who would suffer the horrible fate of the 64 Supermans, but for now we're still before that, in the earlier days of the internet. During that time, most of these websites were being run by, as the name implies, individuals, and the reason for this is due to the fact that infrastructure for people to easily share a website and maintain it communally together wasn't really in existence yet. It was in the era before even 4chan was around back then, and even 4chan's predecessor 2chan was only set up later into this era in 1999, I believe. And even then, wikis were a very new concept at the time, and they only really started to gain popularity in 2001 as people saw how big Wikipedia had gotten. So even when people could be gathered together into a community, at the time, getting them to collaborate together on a website to fill it with information on something still didn't exist as it does today. Creating a website during that time was really difficult due to the fact that 1, you had to pay for internet bandwidth that was really expensive and very unreliable at the same time. 2, Wix wasn't around to harass you on YouTube ads or through sponsors, so at the time, if you wanted to create a website, you had to be able to code it yourself because templates weren't really a thing that existed. And so being a specialist in creating these sites was something that you really had to be able to do well. And 3, you really didn't have very good ways to gather people into communities that could then be pushed towards any of this type of projects due to the fact that most message boards as well didn't really exist during that time. As a result, information online tended to be a bit more lopsided at the point due to the fact that most of these walkthroughs would have been written by a single person, and thus these walkthroughs would inherit both the biases and the specific experiences this person went through, rather than the confirmation of what is likely in the game by a huge number of people, which will make the process a little more holistic. So you might find a 50-page walkthrough for Super Mario Bros. Trying to find out where every single hidden block in the game is, only to find that he spends 45 pages out of his 50-page walkthrough talking about how Mario will go to hell before he dies. And the remaining 5 pages will include like maybe half a page just explaining some very surface level information. That was an era where game magazines, which might be quite an antique nowadays, still tended to have quite a lot of information, and when you could still get quite a lot of magazines or books that were designed purely to give you information on these games, such as the complete guide to a certain game and whatnot. Like this guidebook for the OG Pokemon Yellow. Yeah, I know it's a little scuffed. I think you can probably tell if you look at it. Like, it's a little torn up as well. I mean...
Stop! You violated the law. Pay the court a fine or serve your sentence. Your stolen goods are now forfeit.
No, don't call the police. Okay, I didn't do this. The book was already in this state when I purchased it, since I got it secondhand, since I did not own this from when I was a kid. I had a different one that was in English all that time back, and that one, I have no idea where it is anymore, but you know, for the nostalgia, I decided to buy one at some point, and here you go. Very scuffed, but it's kind of interesting due to the fact that you really get a book that's full of... I mean, any guidebook at the time would probably be like that as well, but you get a lot of information about the dungeons, the Pokemon that will appear in every gym, what Pokemon they would use, how to progress the game. No information about Missing No, obviously, because that's the kind of thing that most official writers wouldn't want you to know about, since it's most likely a bug that was in the game. But yeah, as you can see up here, I mean, for those of you who can read Japanese at least, this is supposed to be the Nintendo official guidebook as well. Funnily enough, they were actually easier accessible back in the day due to the fact that you could just easily go down to a Borders to get one of these books, whereas the information wasn't well documented for free anywhere online, and even if you could find information online, payment gateways and trying to set up ways to pay for this information would have been difficult as well. And so these books, while they weren't cheap, they were probably the most accurate way that you could get information about the game, bugs and exploits notwithstanding, of course. You know, this actually reminds me of how, like, back in the day when I was a kid, I literally only had one guidebook my entire life, which was the Pokemon one I mentioned before. And even when it came to stuff like game magazines, because of how expensive they were, I think I only got 1 month's copy, as in a copy for 1 month, for our magazines I can't remember anymore, which is talking about Ninja Gaiden and Time and Eternity back then. It was very nostalgic stuff. But it's precisely because books like this were still being produced by corporations at the time that there was even less incentive for an individual to try to come up with a complete walkthrough online at the time, simply due to the fact that, like, yeah, you could do it, but at the same time, it's a lot of effort for the individual for no returns at the time. What, did you think people could survive off of just AdSense revenue?
Let's point and laugh.
No, of course not. That was actually even before monetization on the internet was common as well. In fact, if you look at when the Amazon affiliate program was created and when AdSense and Google were implemented in Japan, you will notice that the affiliate program for Amazon was in 2001 and AdSense was only implemented in 2003, both of which would have been in their infancy in this era, which would only last until the earlier half of the early 2000s. But this all changed as we slowly entered the later half of the early 2000s. Forums and message boards were getting more popular. The video of the founder of YouTube pointing at an animal in the zoo was finally released to the internet as well, along with the inception of YouTube itself. More and more people were slowly adopting usage of the internet. And as more people turned into epic Kuma gamers that spent more time on the internet, you started to see more and more people start to congregate on these sites as well. For perspective, 2chan had approximately 11 million active unique users in the year 2008, and this when compared to the Japanese population of 125 million at the time. You can imagine it's a very big proportion of the country's people who are actually using these message boards. Now granted, some of the people using it might be people from overseas who could understand Japanese, who were trawling through the sites looking for information as well. But then again, Duolingo didn't exist back then, so you probably had a lot fewer self-proclaimed Nihongo masters out there trying to figure out how to use this site. So probably believable that at the time there were likely to have been more Japanese people than foreigners using it, so we can just safely assume that at least a large proportion of this 11 million that were made up almost 10% of the nation would have been locals at the time. And it was during this era where some of the people on these message boards came up with a very brilliant idea. You're ready for this? It's gonna blow your mind. Shh, come closer. Come. They thought of working together. Whoa! No way! And it's through these forums and message boards that the people of Japan started to coordinate their efforts, posting links to external websites which become the wikis that we know today, where everyone could post information they knew about the game, and everyone else could vet the information, thereby ensuring that the information there is as accurate and refined as possible, with as little misinformation or mistakes as possible. For the issue with being an individual doing this is that what might have been a bug for one person may have gone unnoticed, but with the fact that everyone else could now work on this wikis together, you had a situation where it would be easier to sift out why certain experiences were different and whether or not bugs existed in the game. So by virtue of the fact that more and more people were involved, you had a bigger sample size to figure out exactly what is the appropriate information that should be going into the wiki and what might be better classified as bugs or potential misinformation as well. That's democracy for you, baby! Also, this was the era where you started to see less and less of strategy guides as well. Like the big official strategy guide that would be sold in stores slowly started to fade out of existence. Like you still see them on the periphery here and there, but bit by bit, these companies were slowly getting phased out. And I suppose it would have been no surprise considering the fact that even if they wanted to compete, now the shoe was on the other turntable, as they were the ones now who did not have the resources to compete with many of these wikis due to the fact that they couldn't compete with the mass of people online who would be able to all actively put information into a wiki and dig in and gather information that might be so sensitive that a book might not be able to print it because the company would probably not want them to release some of this information. And as a result, there was a lot less incentive for people to purchase any of these guidebooks because why do that when you could get even more detailed information online from a free source instead? But that brings us back to the point I was pondering at the start of this video. Are they actually any better? Or is this just another one of those cases of the thousand-folded wheat brain settling in, making them think it's better? Well, as with all other things in life, unfortunately, I'm gonna have to give you the answer. It depends.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Look, I get that no one wants the answer, but let me explain. Don't vote me off the island just yet. Because definitely, while it was true for certain games, particularly niche games that didn't gain as much traction outside of Japan, those might, by virtue of the fact that they got more popularity within Japan, have had a more robust community that could provide more information at the time than if you were to search for information in a global community. You would be hard-pressed to find information in English, but it'll be way easier trying to find information for these games in Japanese wikis. But there is also another reason why whenever you search for a game walkthrough in English, you would tend to get something like game FAQs, an article written by a single person, while in Japanese, if you were to search for the same kind of walkthroughs, you would tend to find wikis being what you are directed to instead. So I've read up a lot about this, but quite frankly, from the amount of information that is out there about the history of why game wikis in English are the way they are, frankly, I feel like you could make a completely new, separate video aside from this video about it. I feel like it could almost double the length of this video if I were to try to talk about just that. Plus, at this point, I really feel like I have not read enough, nor have I gotten enough information from people who first-hand experience most of it to be able to give a good recount about what happens in the English space. So it would be out of my depth to do it now, but if there's enough interest, I'll reach out to some of these groups. Hopefully they'll respond, and maybe I could look into making a video about the English wiki scene in the future as well. That said, for now, I'll keep it simple. So from what I found out, at least from the levels of reading I've done so far, is that wikis were actually rising in popularity in the rest of the world at the same time. The only issue is that unlike in Japan, certain greedy corporate wiki running sites actually decided to monopolize the market of wiki template building. Because one thing you have to understand with wikis is that typically these people are not getting their own domain to do it on. They're using sites that allow one to set up their own wiki. The issue with these corporate wiki sites in the rest of the world that I've read up about so far at least is that not only did they create a monopoly at the time, but the people who own the companies that own these sites didn't really know exactly how they wanted to monetize it. And so at the time, there was a very big issue of them not understanding the tech that they were trying to get control of. And so you ended up with websites that were very bloated with ads, tended to slow down, particularly on mobile, and tended to have wikis that were very shallow due to the fact that are not as well curated, seeing how these websites didn't really give you a way to log whatever information you had entered, meaning that anyone else, anonymous or otherwise, could come into the wiki, change things up without anyone noticing, and until someone notices it, it's just gonna stay there like that. Thankfully, they do have tools to help people revert it, but at the same time, if changes like that are gonna happen all too often, resulting in the loss of information outright, or worse still, if there are certain people running the wiki who refuse to accept that certain other information is correct and choose to force this information onto others, there isn't really a way for people to stop them from doing this either. And so you tended to have information that tends to not be as good, and due to the fact that there are so many ads on the website as well, and it actually slows down performance of the PC to some extent if you have it open for too long, people have started to shift away from the site. And so most of the more enthusiastic wiki creators, like for the Zelda or Fire Emblem wikis for example, tend to have already moved off site, and therefore you tend to have this issue of the wikier ones just having less useful information in general, as the people who do possess this information just refuse to use this site. But, and this is the more important point, that doesn't apply as much to modern wikis, particularly those that manage to break away from these greedy corporate sites are still quite successful and actually do a really good job. The English Sengoku Runs wiki, which if you don't know what the game is, good, don't look it up, was actually one that had more information than its Japanese counterpart, to the point that it actually possessed the entire damage calculation formula of the game, something that the Japanese wikis actually did not have. And so what I'm trying to say with all of this is that wikis which remain largely community controlled and independent actually tended to do very well, even for the English ones as well. And due to the fact that information can now be translated a lot easier due to the improvements in Google Translate as compared to the past, information from these wikis can be pulled and put into each other as well, meaning that global wikis would tend to also not only possess the information the Japanese ones would have, but due to the fact that there is a much bigger community of people that use them, would now have the ability to scrounge up even more information than Japanese wikis would be able to do nowadays. So yes, and also no. Because while Japanese wikis are still pretty good for very specific niche games that are more well and popular in the Japanese community, when it comes to most other games in general, this wouldn't be the case due to the fact that you have a much bigger community working on it. And so global wikis would tend to be on par, if not superior to them nowadays. It's just that a long period of horrible, poorly managed corporatization led to wikis globally being less popular than they ought to originally have been, as compared to the popularity that the Japanese ones got within their communities instead. But then, everything changed when the Money Nation attacked. But yeah, at that time, most of these wikis was largely still not monetized, and it's not difficult to imagine why. At the time, AdSense, things like monetization online were largely still in their infancy. That was around the time of the inception of YouTube, so you can imagine that large forms of what we consider monetization and that will form the basis of online monetization that we know today was still largely being thought out and drafted. And during that era, you can imagine that most people didn't even imagine that you could get rich and get a career off of YouTube. And well, there's also a reason why even to this day Wikipedia is still asking for donations instead of trying to go purely through all of the ad revenue instead. And it is because of this specific reason that we eventually saw the downfall of this era of wikis, where monetization started to get more and more developed and people started to realize that you could earn money off these sites, and it's a very decent amount of money at some point. Less and less people were willing to cooperate on these wikis, and rightfully so, because not everyone is gonna get the money that goes to these wikis. It's typically going to go to the small number of people that own the site. And to the rest of the people who don't get the information, those who really love the game might be willing to say, yeah, we have built up this repository, let's just continue to maintain it and improve it. But there might be many others as well, especially if you're going to start a wiki at that point, who might think, Well, yeah, I could, but why would I give you my information if I'm not gonna profit from it? And you started to see this split where less and less people were contributing, and that resulted in this wiki slowly fading out. And with the idea, or rather the concept of a new style of game that pushed monetization to its limit starting to pop up in the early 2010s, these companies finally saw their chance to make their way back in. And by this, of course, I am just talking about gacha games and the way that this game slowly was starting to be designed to optimize profitability, particularly in the early days of the genre. So a quick word before we get deeper into this, I just need to put this out there because it's kind of pertinent to what I'll be talking about after this, but I have been working in the game industry in Japan for quite a few years now, on both development and production, where development or kaihatsu is the development of new titles and production or une is the production of content for existing titles, mainly live service games like gacha games basically. And when it comes to development, I worked on the development of both new normal title releases as well as gacha games. And so I would be able to say quite confidently now that I have at least some level of an understanding of how these gacha games are designed and operated and how they interact with other companies around them, including their correspondences with many of these game wiki corporations as well, because yes, obviously they're gonna have connections with game companies, and we'll get more into that a little later on as well. I have managed to speak to many people within the wiki companies as well off the record about quite a few things, some of which we'll be talking about in this video as well. So the information I'll be providing now is either through my own experiences within the industry, what I know for a fact is going on in it, or what other people in the industry have spoken to me about. So needless to say, I get that gacha games are quite a contentious thing. There are many people who frown upon the idea of one. I too, after seeing what the effects of these games can have on people firsthand from within the industry, and after seeing how some people within the industry treat the life cycles of these games, I have to say myself that I'm quite against the idea of gachas. So what I'm trying to say, and I don't want this to get twisted or anything, because I know it can be a touchy subject for some people, but I'm not saying that the games themselves are bad. The games themselves are typically designed to be fun still, and for people to enjoy them. It's just that some of the ways that the monetization are designed into these games are a problem, and I'm just saying that while I enjoy the game itself for what it is, I do wish that these forms of monetization within the games are something that the games could have just done without instead. But I do not advocate the termination of every game for gacha outright. Rather, I feel like it's important for these companies to look for new forms of monetization, even if it's for a pre-existing game, to bring these games to a more sustainable position where they are not as exploitative of their consumer base. But yeah, baby steps, right? Who knows, maybe they'll stick around so that 50 years down the road when I'm old and in a retirement home, instead of having to waste all my money on slot machines which have no reward, we'll have gacha games there instead, so at least we get some level of waifus with our walling away our time till our eternal demise. If you guys are interested in this topic, we can talk more about it in another video at another time, but the reason why I'm talking about it for this video is due to the fact that many of these games are designed to be very convoluted as well as very grindy, and this is by intention. They don't want players to be very easily able to predict what they need to do and to be able to do it very easily, because they want to be able to monetize that. So you get people to spend on characters because you do not know what characters you need to clear content in the future. You get them to spend on stamina so they can farm for more resources, so that they can prep for whatever new content may come out in the future, so that they can quickly upgrade everything and be at the forefront of it. There are many ways to do it, and these things are called pain points. And these points are designed into the game with the sheer intention of basically causing discomfort within the player. Not so much that they want to quit the game, but enough that they would want to perhaps throw in that initial the $1 that would... Okay, that didn't go in the track. And all of this is typically done through the intentional deprivation of some level of resources or information. And in the case of resources, it is something that is built into the game in such a way that the game will be balanced so that you can't complete everything without spending. But the thing is, the more convoluted a game, the less likely certain groups of people are likely to want to play it for long. However, it is in the company's interest to keep these groups of people playing as well, either for current or future spending potential that these groups might have, or for the DAU that they provide to keep the game popular, which can then translate to licensing, merchandising profits, or many other ways of making money through the use of the fact that they have a very big player base. In order to do that, this game does need some good repositories of information about the game around the web, like a walkthrough of some sort, whatever that is. The issue is that with these games, it gets quite expensive to spend to get and raise every single character to try and test out the most optimal teams in each and every scenario. And the thing is that in order to do that, you does need a kind of player who can both spend a lot of money on the game and it's also good at the game, which may sound a bit like those two typically don't happen together, but in order to make these kind of walkthroughs a reality, you're kinda gonna have to make that miracle happen. As you can imagine, the idea of a fully collaborative wiki kinda stops to make sense at some point when you consider the fact that the only people who would have full access to all content in the game would be the people who either sold a kidney to be able to afford it, or the people whose dads or moms, because equality, happen to own an oil field or an emerald mine. And with the explosive popularity these games had in Japan towards the earlier half of the 2010s onwards, it is very hard for then community wikis to compete as they were before. And this all changed in 2012 when AppBank released the Puzzle Kyukyoku Koryaku database, which is the Puzzles and Dragons Extreme Conquest database. At that time, Puzzles and Dragons was explosively popular, one of the most popular games for the next few years from that point onwards. During that period of time, they released the database which would act as a guide for the game in general, and then this was followed by the Monster Strike wiki or game guide at that time, which was released in 2013. It was during this period that some of the biggest corporate-owned walkthrough sites that are still in operation today started to pop out as well, with App Media, Game 8, and Game With all popping out during 2013 and 2014, if I'm not mistaken. And somewhere along the way, I'm not exactly sure the exact year due to the fact that it is not stated on their own company's website, but you also have websites like Ultima and Kamigae, which were set up by companies that initially were in some other form of business, but at some point, probably because they saw the initial gold rush in this industry, started to chase the bag in here as well. So in the process of doing research for this video, I was also trying to figure out how much money they were earning off of the database, but unfortunately it doesn't seem like any of the information really exists anymore. Like I even tried looking for their financial reports and even those don't seem to exist, so we can only imagine that the amount from the website was to the point where overall they were earning so much money that it was enough to pull all of these other companies into the industry as well. No, that said, the reason why these companies had such a big edge over a wiki was due to the fact that they could essentially hire and fund the whales. As odd as it is to say that, a lot of them in the early days of this industry's boom used to do that, where they would try to find the best place they could of these games, and they would essentially hire them into the company, give them an allowance to whale while also paying them to write the articles and to update these databases. Needless to say, if you're the kind of person who's spending an entire month's rent on this game to begin with, having even half of that covered would be quite a godsend. And as a result, these companies had a very good advantage going for them that wikis simply could not have, and that was that they could have people in the company spending huge amounts of money on this game to get as many of the characters, resources, what have you not, and find the most optimal compositions of characters that you can out of everything while experimenting to figure out which of these would be the best ones to use. This is something that obviously you and I would never be able to do. So trying to do something like that would be quite an impossibility if anything. So you can imagine with all this money to spend to experiment, these companies were able to write articles with information that was way more in-depth than any player could do on their own. Things like, when it comes to games like Puzzles and Dragons, how to make the most optimal party using the newest of characters while merging them with characters all the way back throughout the entire game's lifespan to create the most optimal party possible. And when you have a game that's now 10 years old, that's a lot of characters. And I think the most interesting one I saw of that era was probably the one for Princess Connect. I mean, for those of you who have never played that game before, it's basically an auto game created by Sai Games, where you just push the ultimate skills of characters and that's the only activation you do in battle. The thing is that at some point in the game's lifespan, the way that the battles worked was so precise due to the fact that certain characters were able to do insane amount of damage if everything was timed right, that at some point when it came to things like clan battles or just like high difficulty challenges, you kind of had this websites writing there on the website with like second by second breakdowns of what to push when. So they would tell you like, okay, the battle is 1 minute 30 seconds. At 1 minute 10 seconds remaining, you're going to want to push this skill. At 1 minute 09 seconds, push this. And then 8 seconds, push this. And then they will give you the entire order all the way down. There was things like this where they could give you second by second breakdowns of what to do that really solidified in my mind at least that these companies were onto something really insane in terms of the information they were putting out in a way that the regular players just could not compete with anymore. And so you really started to feel a disparity that could only be overcome by using these wikis. And that, to me, was the golden era of these wikis and their use, when they were simply just putting out information that was far beyond the reach of us poor mortals who were unable to put our entire life savings and our soul into the game itself. These companies were able to do that, and that gave them a huge advantage and pushed the idea of company-run wikis to the forefront of how game wikis would work, especially for this kind of gacha games. Eventually, these wikis would hit critical mass as well, for obviously when something is profitable, more and more people would move in, and eventually the profitability would go down as more supply is added into the market, and eventually it'll hit a critical mass where companies won't be as profitable as they were when the industry initially boomed. What this means is that these companies that had been expanding all this time were slowly starting to find that they wouldn't be able to expand as much anymore. But obviously, if you're a company and you have shareholders, you're gonna want to keep showing them growth. And so you need to show them somehow or another that you're able to earn more profits in spite of the fact that your industry is so saturated it can't grow anymore. And so this began to lead into what we could call the steady decline of the industry. So, quick question. I mean, this is probably going to be a very simple one as well. I want you all to put your thinking caps on right now and answer this question. When a company needs to earn profits, but it can't increase its profitability by increasing sales anymore because the industry is too saturated, what's another way a company is quite likely to go about earning profits? If your answer was that they were going to start cutting costs, you are correct. Congratulations. You did it. So the thing with that, of course, therein lies the issue that if you're going to keep cutting costs, what's the easiest way to do it? Fire people. And if you keep firing your talent, what's going to happen when you try to hire cheaper? You're going to find less and less talented or knowledgeable people, because eventually you're going to reach the point where all the people who could know a lot about the game would not be willing to accept your prices anymore when you keep trying to reduce like your salary and all that. And another big way obviously would be to cut the expenditure on the allowance that will be given to these people to spend on the game. Problem with that is that if because of that they spend less overall, they might not be able to gather as much information as they otherwise could have, and therefore the quality of the articles would begin to fall as well, which would lead to a downward spiral of the number of people who would come to your site, since the quality of the information would slowly decay as less and less competent people are put into the position and less money is given to these people to even experiment with the game, which then leads to many underhanded practices within the industry which begin to rise in this period. And the biggest one of them all is plagiarism, obviously. And this was a thing that came up with many of the big wiki or game guide sites as well, including those like GameWith and Game8, with a very big case of GameWith actually copying the map for a Fist of the North Star game in the past, as in they actually took someone else's map from another site and just traced it one for one and put it on their site and said it was their own thing because no, it's different, we drew it ourselves. The only way this was actually caught was due to the fact that the initial map had an error in it, and because they copied the map completely, they had to remove the watermarks and clean up quite a bit, so as you can imagine, it didn't really go too well for them. Then there's also another case from back in the day that was reported on here and there, and which you can still find fragments of the information on nowadays, which was on the case of two brothers who apparently were running the wiki for a mobile game called Road to Dragons. What happened with that specific case was that they actually realized, because of the fact that their wiki was actually doing pretty well at the time, that there was another wiki which seemed to have some level of similarity to theirs in terms of the content. with that wiki essentially putting up what they had put up verbatim, and as well as adding a little bit more of its own content on top of that. When they noticed that, in some big 5D chess brain Game of Thrones move, they intentionally added wrong information into their own wiki article because of the fact that they understood that, well, if this person truly was imitating them, then this mistake that they made would also end up in that person's article, since this was something that they had done which was meant to be very obviously wrong, to try and just test the person. And wouldn't you believe it? Big shock, surprise Pikachu face, but the person actually used that information verbatim as well. So obviously they realized that they were having that information on their wiki copied by that other wiki. So they actually sent a email to that person trying to contact them to ask them about why this was happening. Unfortunately, in their case, they didn't get any form of recourse in the end. Far from it, what actually happened was that after they made this report to the other wiki themselves, not only did they not get any form of reply at all, but they also started to notice an uptick in the number of trolls as well as bots being sent to harass them, and so they eventually closed down the wiki. Needless to say, the game itself ended service in 2017, so the other wiki no longer exists, so it's a little difficult for me to pull up that information. And also there's the fact that they weren't willing to share that information neither with me nor with any of the other people that interviewed them, so there's no way for us to know for sure now what this wiki was that they were in contention with, but I would guess that people who were playing the game at the time might have a better idea of what exactly transpired during that time. And this was the state of the industry by the second half of the late 2010s. On top of that, you had insiders within the industry as well, and these were things that I learned from speaking to people within these companies, using the connections I had to them with the previous companies I worked in the past. And when I spoke to them off the record about some of this stuff, they actually mentioned how, well, for many of the new people that join the company now, it has reached the point where the seniors in the company are telling them, don't think too hard about all of this. Just look at the other companies and copy them.
We've got to have money.
Like, it has gotten to the level where plagiarism is now the norm, and as a result, there is no longer as much of an incentive for people to come up with new information. Because by virtue of the fact that it's very easy to search for and copy information now and post information online, it doesn't take a lot of time for one wiki site to produce almost exactly the same information as another. Like, the moment information goes out on one website, if you can get it up within the same hour, just quickly editing parts of it and then uploading it as your own, you do not lose that much traffic. And the benefit of that is that in the end, as a result, you still maintain some level of profitability on your site, even without the talent required. And therefore, you can actually lower costs and increase profitability. The issue with this is that it has slowly caused the industry to decay to the point that there are a lot of companies now that are actually vultures like this, just waiting for information to come out and then just stealing that information. In fact, and this is something you can see in one of the articles I've linked down below as well, some of these companies have even resorted to highly exploitative crowdsourcing for their articles instead, paying people somewhere around 300 to 500 yen per article that is written. And so if you think about it, if you're going to write a proper article, one that would probably take like 1 or 2 hours of writing and planning at minimum, and that's still very little time given to it, you would still be earning on an 8-hour work week maybe 4,000 yen to 8,000 yen a day, and that is very, very low compared to how much most people would be earning just working a normal job instead. Because as the textbook to set my face this entire time has stated, in order for you to earn 240,000 yen, you will need to be working every day for the entire month, and even then it's give or take thereabout, which would put you about the same as the average fresh graduate, which would be fine if not for the fact that this excludes the overtime pay that all graduates are entitled to, and the fact that all of these graduates actually only have to work 5 days a week and they still get their days off every year as well. And when it comes to the overtime pay, you could argue that like, oh, but yeah, if you work the 8 hours a day, you're technically earning the same amount as someone who chooses to only work that amount of time. But one thing you have to understand is that there has been an increase in the number of companies that either giving 50% or the entirety of the overtime pay upfront instead. Many of the game companies that I've interviewed with in the past as well either give the entire amount, which is quite common among the bigger ones. And when it comes to small, medium corporations, they tend to give 50% of it. So either way, while it's true that other industries may not be the same, it is safe to say that most likely for more of the more modern, more hip with the kids sort of companies, they would tend to already be factoring all of this in, since it is a very good incentive that they can give, while technically making sure that the employees are also more well taken care of. Sites such as this, paying people 300 yen for a Fate ground order, there's a typo in there as well, article, you can really see that they are trying to charge people as minimal as possible to write these articles, which means that if you really wanted to turn a profit being a full-time game article writer at this point, it's either you're working full-time at a company that's paying you a fair salary, or you're gonna need to start copying other people's articles, for otherwise you wouldn't be able to earn enough to earn a decent wage when every single article is only giving you 300 to 500 yen each. In fact, it gets so bad that some of these companies, by virtue of the fact that they know they do not have people talented enough to immediately be able to write an article detailing the information about the characters as well as how useful they are, the moment they drop in a new banner in a gacha, for example, some of them have begun to, for the sake of search engine optimization, releasing empty pages just full of nothing but text saying, well, we'll be updating this in a minute, please wait, and then it just stays like that for quite a while, even after the game releases, all for the sake of just driving views to the page to earn ad revenue. Needless to say, it's kind of obvious why they're doing this. It's also in part because they want to avoid the responsibility of saying that the character is S tier at the start, having someone spend $1,000 on the gacha and then going afterwards, no, C tier, this is not good, we made a mistake, we completely misread the skill or something like that. And you kind of really want to avoid such situations as the company, since it would really ruin their reputation. And by virtue of the fact that they have been constantly firing talent, there are less and less people within the company who can make a good judgment call on what is good just through looking at the character before it even releases. And therefore, they either have to wait for another article to release after so that they can copy it, or experiment after the character releases, which would end up causing them to slow down a lot compared to the level of quality they used to have in the past. And so, realizing that there has been a fall in profitability in the industry, and that the random salarymen they have been hiring to write these articles just aren't able to compete with people who are highly dedicated, and therefore their user base has been drifting away, many of these companies have begun to look for other ways of making money. One of these things that these companies have started to do is what are called ad tie-ups. One of the companies that really does this quite a lot is GameWorth. As you can see from this graph here, the smaller lighter green bar at the top is what is called their tie-up ads. And what this means is that you, as a company, would pay them and they will write a customized article for your game. And this is typically meant for pre-release or when the game just released, to give people information about the game. So even though the dark green part of the graph, which is the amount they're earning from ad revenue, is still increasing, as you can see, the amount of money they're increasing proportionally from this tie-up ads has also been increasing to 24.1% of their profits by the end of 2018. And the reason why this is worrying is due to the fact that these companies are now no longer financially motivated to write high-quality articles where they are giving players information about the games that they want to play. Instead, they are slowly increasing their profit margins from directly advertising something that the company is paying them to advertise instead. And you might be thinking like, yeah, it's nothing too big of an issue if it's a paid ad, right? As long as they are forthcoming with the information they're providing. But the issue here therein lies is the fact that some of the time they are no longer providing information based off their own value judgment anymore. And I'm saying this as someone on the other side of the conversation that happens between the game company and the wiki company. So sometimes, obviously not all companies do this, I want to say that now, but many of them, what they are doing is that they are now essentially getting information about the game from the game company, wherein the game company is telling them like, yeah, we think by virtue of the fact that we developed this, that this is S tier and that is C tier and so on and so forth. And then like, this is what is good about the game and that's what isn't good. And they will give this information to the company, and then they will write an article based off the information and pass it back to the company, the game company, to vet after that. So the issue with this is that the information is no longer based off a value judgment by someone within the game Wiki's company looking at the game, analyzing it, and deciding to write an article based off their own analysis and opinions. Some of the time, what they are writing is effectively what the company is telling them is the truth. And as you can imagine, when it comes to gacha games, the fact that the game company is giving you the tier list at times can be a little worrying. There are times, especially in modern games, where because of the fact that this information may not have been shared completely clearly with the people writing the game articles, there has been cases where they would rate a game's character like maybe an S tier pre-release, and then the moment the game releases, at some point it just drops to a C tier instead, which, as you can imagine, by virtue of the fact that companies are being involved in the writing of these articles, it has to make you wonder a little. Because obviously these are just my assumptions. These are not allegations towards a certain specific company or anything, right? Because not all companies are doing this, obviously, but there is the possibility that certain companies might be feeding them false information to increase profitability by telling people the wrong information, getting them to reroll for the wrong characters at the start, or spend money on the wrong characters and then spend more money on the character that was initially meant to be S tier instead. I feel like this last bit has gotten a little bit dark, but yeah, this basically summarizes the entirety of the last period where corporations started to move in. They were initially really good at their job, but as they grew bigger and they got more and more competition, they kind of lost the drive to do what was most important for their job, which was to actually look for and come up with the best and information that they can actually find themselves. And that's how we ended up in this current state where they are more driven by profitability, and that has pushed them more into the hands of the game companies than they ought to be, especially with game companies that are more focused on gacha games, since those do also tend to see and focus more on profitability in the long term. So this relationship between the two may not be as healthy as it may seem on the surface. But don't worry, it's not all bad, because while these companies are still quite prevalent nowadays, they are slowly losing their relevancy as more and more ways of getting information out there have slowly started to pop up. Because one of the biggest changes since those days is the fact that monetization online, in particular through ads, as you can see on YouTube as well nowadays, has become a lot more viable than it was back in the early 2010s as well. You might remember that was around the time when along with many of the other famous people on YouTube, or, well, infamous in some of their cases. And nowadays, you can kind of find people producing all sorts of content on the internet as well. So if you wanted to find information about a specific game, you can probably find plenty of channels that talk about it. Right? You want to find information about MTG, there's going to be like 50 channels probably talking about it, maybe more. You want to look for information for Counter-Side, it's probably going to be there. Toho, definitely there. FGO, maybe not so much nowadays. Blue Archive, it's booming. Battle Girl High School games dead, there's nothing to produce, but maybe you can find some. But what I'm trying to say is that in a sense, we have slowly reverted back to the early days of the internet in terms of the style of the content, where we went from individuals making it to collaborative efforts to make it, to the corporations making it now. And then now we slowly start to see more and more of the reverse, where people and communities are basically becoming the driving force once again, as these corporations slowly start to become less relevant as a result of their own inability to not be greedy. Because with many of these game communities on YouTube as well, right, even if a channel is run by one person, he does not run it in isolation. He might look for information online as well. He might chat with other YouTubers who are very famous in the field as well, or maybe with his fans, the viewers, all of whom might also be as proficient, if not more proficient than him. And it's this hybrid, you could say, of where individuals are making content but are doing it in collaboration with the greater community as well, that has led to a shift which I feel may lead to a change going forward in a more positive light as well. There, and you have plenty of other better ways of communicating with other people around the world to gather information as well. You have Discord. Many games also use Discord as a way to serve as a repository for information, as well as to allow for players to communicate with each other. You have Reddit, which I'm not sure if the blackout is still going on at this point. At the moment of me recording this, at least it's still going on for certain of the Reddit pages. Is that what they're called? I feel very old for not knowing what the things on Reddit are called, but those the R's, right? R slashes are they. But yes, while typically you would want to stay away from Reddit unless you want to get terminal cancer, I would say that Reddit, Discord, they do serve as mediums for people to get information as well. And nowadays, you're starting to see more and more wikis start to break away from corporate-controlled websites as well, which is also nice. I believe there are many more that are also starting to follow in the footsteps of the Zelda and the RuneScape wiki, which, not gonna lie, what they did at the point in time as well was really cool. And even in Japan, while they are corporate-controlled, the websites I mean, most of the corporations that control these wiki sites tend not to be as invasive as the ones overseas. I think that's one thing that also surprised me quite a bit, since I do use them quite a lot as well, is the fact that they don't have as strong of an emphasis on ads, and they tend to leave things pretty hands off. That's the thing. I was about to say arms off, which sounded kind of weird, but hands off, and as a result, people do get the ability to manage these sites on their own and ensure that the information as well as the flow of information into the website are controlled in a way to ensure as much accuracy as possible. And by this, I do mean community wikis that are up on corporate control sites, kind of like Wikia and Fandom in the rest of the world. But yes, suffice to say, things have been changing more and more in recent years, and we will have to see going forward where this will lead us, because of the fact that while if I made this video 5 years ago, I would still probably say that, yeah, corporate game walkthroughs, especially the Japanese ones, they do still seem to be doing a pretty good job. But in this day and age, especially after the whole, not so happy time that everyone got locked inside, a lot more channels on YouTube started popping up for all manner of game content as well. And this has resulted in a shift where you do not really have to depend on corporate walkthrough sites anymore. You can find plenty of players online who would give you their reasoning and rationale in real time, and you can ask them anything you want, or just go through the entire video catalog and find out things about the game that sometimes these corporate websites may not even remember to log, especially with the fact that when it comes to more modern games, they have slowly started to lose touch with how to produce good articles. This has become even more of a reason that people can actually get in there and produce things that may one day push this corporation, while not fully out of the field, at least it will push the industry into a more stable state, I suppose, as more and more companies realize that this is no longer a highly profitable industry and start to pull out and leave only those that are willing to put in the effort and stay competitive left in the industry. That, or maybe one day they'll just turn into another wiki or Fandom or something. I really hope that doesn't happen, but who knows, if they get desperate enough. But at the very least, we're starting to see them shift more and more from being sites that give you walkthroughs on how to clear the game specifically to more of websites that are trying to be an overall nexus of information. So more like a gaming related news site. It feels like they'll eventually come into competition with another industry or another at some point, but suffice to say, they are shifting away, and we will probably see over the next few years even more changes in how all of these walkthrough sites are actually handled in the end. But yeah, that brings me to the quite likely end of this video. I'm not sure how long this is gonna end up being. Hopefully it's not too long. I have a creeping suspicion it's probably gonna end up being maybe, hopefully not more than an hour. I don't want this video to get to be too long as well. But yeah, hopefully this video gave you something interesting to take away from all of this. To just summarize all of it, put very simply, yes, in the past there was a period of time where Japanese wikis could arguably be considered for specific types of games or genres of games to be more accurate than English wikis, but when it comes to gaming overall, especially for games that aren't from Japan, maybe not so much to begin with. And nowadays, as more and more people speak the English, we have started to see more and more people able to collaborate on a much bigger scale than before. And with the fact that more and more people have become masters of Duolingo, you start to see more people who are able to gather information from these Japanese wikis and put them into English ones as well. So at this point, it really does feel like English wikis, they should be more or less equal, if not better, in terms of their ability to provide information to their users. And aside from that, we did cover the entirety of the history of wikis and game walkthrough sites in Japan from start to end, from when it was run by a single person to the point where it was run by corporations, to the point where these corporations don't seem to be as competent at their job anymore, and how individuals on things like YouTube and TikTok and whatnot are slowly coming back in and changing this whole system once again to favor more individual creators once again, which in my opinion, is a pretty cool thing. So yeah, hopefully we're headed in that good and interesting direction where more people get into it on an individual level or as a team, as a group. Hopefully not as a monetary organization whose incentives may not align with the desire to just provide information. But this is where we're at. Hopefully it gets better. We will continue to see from here. And maybe another 10, 15, 20 years down the road, if I'm still alive and running this channel, we can go into it once again and look at how much the idea of game walkthrough, how the information is being presented to the people at large is being done, if there's anything interesting that has changed since then. That's all I have for you guys today. Once again, hopefully the video was interesting. Do let me know what you feel about the video in the comments down below. I don't know if I'd actually want to make a Patreon yet. I know someone in the past, Garbage Hypocrite. I can't pronounce words right, it seems like, but yes, I believe it was Garbage Hypocrite 4196. Had to look at the side screen to just make sure the numbers were correct. That suggests that I should make a Patreon as well. If you guys are interested in like donating $1 or something, let me know. Maybe I'll set it up, but it's just an interest check if anyone actually wants to do that. Otherwise, I'll keep it as is, because money isn't too much of an issue for me since I'm still working right now, at least. Maybe not in the next few months, because this is just a little update for those who are interested in anything IRL related for what's going on here, for me at least. I'll be changing jobs in the next few months, so that may lead to some form of like time changes in terms of how much I can release videos and all that. Probably would increase during the time that I'm more free, but yeah, don't worry about it. I've already found a new job. It's just more of like I wanted to get a transition period to the new place. Then maybe we can talk about why I decided to leave my old job as well. I don't know if that would actually be interesting. It's like it's just game companies doing their thing, so but yes, the next video will be coming out the week after as usual. I might add another like video or two, like quick simple ones before after that, just to like announce certain things related to certain events that will be occurring soon in the rest of Japan. So we'll see how that goes. I have to plan all that out, but yeah, that's the plan for now. So if you're interested in any of that, do feel free to like and subscribe for this type or maybe other types of content I have on the channel, like game reviews of super bad Japanese games, or just me talking about like weeb events within Japan, because there are a lot of them. I'll be talking about the Blue Archive exclusive one at some point as well, hopefully soon. There's a bunch of stuff to get through now. It's like there's so many things that I wanted to talk about, and like there's not that much time due to the fact that I have to work, and then like I can produce 2 videos a month, and I have to like edit everything myself as well. I'm not too good at this, as you can see. Whoa! And so I have to like think about a lot of things to get it to work. I don't know what I'm doing with my hand. It's helping me to concentrate a little more, I guess. But yeah, so if you're interested in any of those types of videos, more will be coming soon. So hopefully you look forward to that. I'll be heading off now. So hopefully I'll see you guys again in another video soon. Enjoy the rest of your time until we meet again. Take care and